Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel From Occupation to Liberation. The story of Crimea's full retaking is not just a tale of military maneuvers and territorial maps, but a defining chapter in modern history that reshaped the meaning of resistance, sovereignty, and national will. For more than a decade, Crimea stood as a symbol of unfinished business, a wound in Ukraine's national consciousness, and a showcase of Russian power projection. When Russian forces seized the peninsula in 2014, the world watched as borders were redrawn not by diplomacy, but by force. Many believed that Crimea was lost forever, locked behind layers of military fortifications, propaganda, and international paralysis. Yet history has a way of defying certainty, and the liberation of Crimea proved that no occupation is permanent when confronted by determination, patience, and strategic evolution. The occupation of Crimea began swiftly and silently, under the cover of deniability and misinformation. Armed men without insignia appeared overnight, key government buildings were seized, and within weeks Russia had effectively absorbed the peninsula. The annexation was declared irreversible, celebrated domestically as a historic correction, and defended internationally through political narratives and military deterrence. Crimea became one of the most heavily militarized regions in Eastern Europe, transformed into a fortress with air defense systems, naval assets, missile platforms, and tens of thousands of troops. The Black Sea Fleet expanded its presence, and the peninsula was integrated into Russia's military planning as an untouchable stronghold. For years, this perception held, reinforced by the lack of immediate military response and the slow grind of diplomatic condemnation. For Ukraine, however, Crimea was never forgotten. Even as the country faced ongoing conflict in the east, political instability, and economic pressure, the idea of reclaiming Crimea remained embedded in its national strategy. It was not a question of if, but when. Ukrainian leadership understood that attempting to retake Crimea prematurely would be disastrous. Instead, the path to liberation required transformation of the military, of intelligence capabilities, of alliances, and of public resilience. Ukraine embarked on a long process of reforming its armed forces, modernizing command structures, and learning from years of hard combat experience. Each battle fought elsewhere became preparation for the one that truly mattered. As the broader war intensified, Crimea gradually shifted from being a distant symbol to a central objective. Ukrainian planners recognized that the peninsula's strength was also its vulnerability. Crimea depended heavily on supply routes from mainland Russia, particularly through bridges, ports, and air corridors. Severing these lifelines would slowly suffocate the occupying forces. Rather than launching a single massive assault, Ukraine adopted a strategy of attrition and isolation. Precision strikes targeted logistics hubs, ammunition depots, radar systems, and command centers. Each successful strike chipped away at the myth of Crimea's invincibility and forced Russian forces into a reactive posture. The psychological dimension of this campaign was just as critical as the physical one. Russian soldiers stationed in Crimea were told they were safe, far from the front lines, stationed in a region that would never be challenged. When explosions began reaching deep into the peninsula, that illusion shattered. Morale declined as uncertainty grew. Supply shortages, communication disruptions, and constant alert status eroded discipline and confidence. At the same time, Ukrainian messaging intensified, aimed not only at international audiences but directly at Crimean residents and Russian troops. The message was clear: Crimea was not forgotten and liberation was coming. civilians played a silent yet decisive role in the liberation process. Despite years of repression, surveillance, and forced loyalty, many residents of Crimea maintained quiet resistance. Information flowed through underground networks, movements were tracked, and critical intelligence reached Ukrainian planners. Acts of defiance, though often unseen, weakened the occupying administration's control. The occupation had promised stability and prosperity, but delivered isolation, militarization, and fear. As Ukrainian operations intensified, more civilians began to believe that change was possible, that the peninsula might one day return to Ukraine. The turning point came when Ukraine achieved dominance not through overwhelming numbers, but through superior coordination. Air defenses that once made Crimea a no-go zone were systematically degraded. Naval assets were pushed back or neutralized, diminishing Russia's ability to project power from the Black Sea. Bridges and transit routes became unreliable, forcing Russian forces to ration supplies and reposition units. What had once been a fortress slowly became a trap. Every reinforcement sent to Crimea faced increasing risk, while evacuation became logistically complex and politically humiliating. As Ukrainian forces advanced closer, the world watched with cautious disbelief. Analysts who once dismissed the possibility of Crimea's liberation began revising their assessments. The peninsula was no longer a rear area, it was an active battlefield. Russian command faced an impossible choice: commit massive resources to hold Crimea and risk catastrophic losses elsewhere, or withdraw and concede a symbolic defeat of historic proportions. Internal disagreements and delayed decisions further weakened Russian response. The occupation that had begun with speed and confidence now unraveled under pressure and indecision. The final phase of liberation unfolded with calculated precision. Ukrainian forces advanced methodically, avoiding unnecessary destruction while maintaining relentless pressure. Russian units, isolated and demoralized, began to surrender or retreat. Command structures fractured as communication collapsed. Some positions were abandoned without resistance, not because they lacked firepower, but because the will to fight had evaporated. The myth of permanent occupation dissolved in real time, replaced by the reality of collapse. When Ukrainian flags were raised across liberated cities and military installations, the moment carried weight far beyond the battlefield. It was not just territory being reclaimed, but dignity, justice, and historical continuity. For Ukraine, Crimea's liberation represented the restoration of sovereignty and the fulfillment of a promise made to its people years earlier. For Russia, it marked a devastating blow to national prestige and strategic credibility. The loss of Crimea undermined narratives of strength and exposed the limits of coercive power in the modern era. The international implications were immediate and far-reaching. Allies who had supported Ukraine saw validation of their commitment, while neutral observers reevaluated assumptions about military power and deterrence. The liberation of Crimea sent a clear message that territorial conquest could be reversed, even against a larger and heavily armed adversary. It reshaped security calculations across Europe and beyond, reinforcing the principle that borders imposed by force are neither legitimate nor permanent. Yet liberation brought challenges alongside celebration. Years of occupation left deep scars, damaged infrastructure, displaced populations, and unresolved grievances. Restoring governance, rebuilding trust, and reintegrating Crimea required patience and care. Ukraine faced the immense task of ensuring security while protecting civilian rights and addressing the humanitarian consequences of prolonged militarization. The process of healing would take time, but the foundation was laid by the very act of liberation itself. For the Ukrainian people, Crimea's return became a defining national moment, a story passed from one generation to the next. It symbolized resilience in the face of overwhelming odds and the power of unity under pressure. Soldiers who fought elsewhere in the country saw their sacrifices vindicated. Families separated by occupation found hope in reunion. The idea of Ukraine as a sovereign, indivisible nation was no longer aspirational. It was proven. From occupation to liberation, Crimea's journey reshaped modern warfare narratives. It demonstrated that patience can be as powerful as firepower, that information and morale can decide battles before they are fought, and that even the strongest fortresses can fall when cut off from legitimacy and support. The liberation of Crimea was not a sudden miracle, but the result of years of endurance, adaptation, and belief. History will remember Crimea not only as a battleground, but as a lesson that occupation breeds resistance, that force cannot erase identity, and that the will of a determined nation can outlast even the most entrenched control. As the dust settled over the peninsula, one truth became undeniable. Crimea was no longer a symbol of loss, but of liberation, and its story would echo far beyond the Black Sea, shaping how the world understands power, resistance, and the enduring fight for sovereignty.